Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talks in Class. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so happy to have you here. My name is Jenna. Welcome to the show. I am coming to you from my time capsule bedroom here at my mom's house in Wisconsin. I am visiting, as I do, and I'm right in the middle of my trip. I've been here for 1 week. I have 1 week to go, so one down, one to go, and I'm starting to fear that perhaps 2 weeks in Wisconsin in the summer is not enough time because I can't believe it's already been a week. I feel like I haven't even taken a breath. I have not sat down. As I mentioned, the Midwest in the summertime, it is on another level because here's the thing. It is a frozen wasteland in the wintertime, so you can't say no to anything in the summertime. And everything happens in the summertime because that's the only nice weather. So it's like you have to cram a whole year's worth of living into 3 months. But then you add in the factor that now I'm in my 30s. A lot of my friends don't necessarily live here anymore. So then it's like, if you all come to town, then you have to try to see people. It's just a lot. But it has been so much fun. I got to see a lot of people already, which is always great. I have a couple people that I only see maybe once a year, and then some people that I just very rarely see. It's just kind of if our paths happen to cross being in town at the same time. So got to have coffee with one of my closest friends in from high school. Like she's one of my oldest friends last week. And then I attended our hometown festival over the weekend. And you know what? I'm happy to report that we have now become those old people who just kind of sit around and like tell the same jokes, play the same songs at the bars. It's funny because that saying, everything changes but nothing changes, or whatever the saying is, if you are from a small town, especially a small town in the Midwest, like nothing has ever made more sense to me than that phrase, because that's exactly how it is. It's like, wow, everything's different. Like my friends have babies now and we have kids, but like at the same time, everything is pretty much exactly the same. So I hope everybody else has been having a great week. Wish me luck in my my final week here. As always, I will start the episode with my what good happened. And you know what? I have to give myself credit with this week's What Good Happened. My What Good Happened is that I survived all 3 days of Catfish Days, all 3 days of our hometown festival. I didn't know if I was going to make it even 2 days in a row, and I ended up making it all 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And here's the thing. If you've ever done something like this, you know the rule is to not go too hard on the first day, but for some reason, I always go too hard on the first day, so I felt rough come Saturday morning, but we made it through. It was very fun. It was very hot, but I actually didn't feel that bad. I think I drank I don't even know, probably as many waters as I drank any other beverage, so that was probably my saving grace. These are the lessons that you learn as you grow up and become something of an adult. So for this week's episode, we're diving back into another nostalgic summer movie, and what better movie to cover while I am back home in my time capsule bedroom, hanging out with all of the friends that I used to frequently attend parties in fields with back in the day, but this classic film about high school parties, Dazed and Confused. I feel like everyone has a couple of movies that they watched constantly as a teenager. I actually feel like I have 1 or 2 movies like this for pretty much every stage of my life. As a really young kid, it was Wizard of Oz and The Little Mermaid. My poor mother had to listen to those munchkins sing all day, every day. I mean, I probably watched it 2 or 3 times a day when I was a kid. I used to try to put my cat, I had a gray cat, and I used to try to put it in a basket to pretend she was Toto. And I mean, if you've ever met a cat, you can probably guess how that went. Not well. And then in middle school, it was Empire Records. I was obsessed with Empire Records. My friends and I would literally watch it, rewind the tape because it was a VHS, and watch it again. And we would just keep it on a loop pretty much all the time. But in high school, it was Dazed and Confused. I truly cannot count how many times I have seen this movie. So many times. It's up there with Clueless and probably just a couple of others on the list of movies that I've probably watched the most times in my life. I know every single line. I know every single scene. I know every single song. And I mean, I'm not gonna lie, there's a pretty obvious reason why my friends and I loved this movie so much in high school. We were teenagers and we liked to party. We fancied ourselves party kids, I guess. And Dazed and Confused is simply a movie about teenagers partying. I mean, there's really not that much more to the movie than that. The movie really doesn't have much of a plot, which is one of the criticisms that I hear about this movie sometimes when people do have something critical to say about it. That's usually what it is. Nothing happens. But to me, that's the beauty of Dazed and Confused. It's a day in the life of a bunch of teenagers on the last day of school, arguably the most exciting day of the entire year when you're that age. And even though it takes place in 1976, I cannot tell you how real this movie felt to me. And it still does. Even rewatching it now, it's such an accurate depiction of my own teenage life. It's kind of unbelievable. So if it's been a while since you have seen this masterpiece of teenage cinema, let me recap it for you. Dazed and Confused is a 1993 movie set in 1976, which is only a 17-year difference. That's kind of hard to wrap my mind around. 17 years, it's already been 31 years since 1993 when the movie was made, if that helps put that into perspective. So, okay, I mean, we have to do the math. We have to hurt our feelings with the math. If this movie were to be made today, in 2024, it would be set in 2007. 2007. I was 2 years out of high school in 2007. And just as the trend cycles have young people now obsessing over the fashion of the late 90s and the 2000s, back in the 90s and 2000s, we, as young people, were obsessed with the 60s and the 70s, especially the fashion. So I think the movie taking place when it does was a big part of the appeal, for me at least. Had the movie been set in present day, which at the time, again, would have been 1993, it would have had a very different feel, and I don't think that I would have appreciated it as much. The Gen X vibes of the early 90s were not something that I just had an appreciation for. I needed more time to have gone by, so I think that the setting is very important. So the movie follows a group of high school students on their last day of school in 1976, or rather I should say it follows a few different groups of students who all kind of commingle in different ways to kind of form this greater group. And that's really it. I mean, honestly, there's not much of a plot. There's some freshman hazing. There are some minor relationship storylines, but nothing too important to the story. There's a party, but really it's just a hangout movie. It's a hangout movie showing teenagers being teenagers. And it's much less about the story, I think, than it is about the characters. And there are a lot of characters. I never really realized how many characters there were in this movie until I started thinking about how to talk about them for this podcast. You have to think of them, I think, as small groups that form parts of a whole. So first there are the football players. We have Randy Floyd, who they call Pink, played by Jason London from Mallrats, and his group of friends, including Rip from Yellowstone as an almost unrecognizable redhead, and one of the vampires from the Buffy movie, which I think was the year before this. And then there's repeat senior O'Bannon, played, of course, famously by Ben Affleck. And God, you guys, there is something about Ben Affleck playing a loud, obnoxious dude who you just kind of want to punch in the face. He does it so well. It's really kind of amazing how well he plays this type of character. The story behind O'Bannon is that apparently he flunked his senior year, so he's joining up with the incoming seniors again to repeat his senior year. And I feel like this was kind of a cliche in teen movies for a while. The idea of someone failing senior year and then having to be a senior again. And I don't know, maybe it's just my school, but I don't think that this would happen. I actually remember there were two guys in my school, not my graduating class, but a couple of years older than me, and they didn't graduate because they were super behind on their schoolwork, or maybe they just skipped too much school or something. For whatever reason, they weren't allowed to graduate because they had work that they needed to make up or correct or whatever. But basically, they just had to take all the coursework home and do it themselves and then turn it in at some point, and then they would get their diplomas. I don't know how exactly they did it, but I'm pretty sure that was the basis of this solution. They didn't like come back and repeat the entire year again. We didn't see them walking the halls of the high school the following year. So I would love to know if that actually ever happened. Like, how embarrassing. Imagine having to be a senior twice. But whatever, that's the story behind Ben Affleck's character in this movie. But more importantly, he is the school's resident obnoxious ass, basically. His whole personality of the character revolves around terrorizing freshmen, basically, which we can assume he also spent the previous year doing because, again, he's a repeat senior. But he's clearly enjoying this power trip, and that's kind of all you need to know about this character. Then there are the stoner kids, most notably Slater, who is played by Rory Cochrane, who was Lucas in Empire Records, another favorite of mine. And his stoner character is a little bit over the top, but even rewatching it now, it doesn't feel too cartoon. It feels true to some of the high school stoners that I knew. Not a lot of them, like most stoners were kind of like low-key stoners, but then there were the kids who made it their entire personality. Like they were just always goofy. They had long hair. They wore weird psychedelic t-shirts from the hippie store at the mall, and they always had a hemp necklace on and probably a hacky sack in their pocket. They just like really played into that stereotype of being a burnout. And I knew kids like this. I mean, they were my friends in high school. But then there's the other stoners. There's Pickford, who feels a little bit more realistic. He has long hair and a hippie girlfriend, but he's coherent. Being a burnout is not his whole personality. And then there's Mila Jovovich, who is Pickford's said hippie girlfriend. She has a really small part in this movie. I don't even know if she has a line, honestly, but she is so great. Her look is 10 out of 10, 11 out of 10. She has long straight hair and she wears fringe vests and big flare jeans and beads. And as a kid in the 2000s who worshipped the styles of the 60s and 70s, her look was everything that I wanted to be. And then we have the kind of nerdy, brainy seniors. We have Cynthia, who has the most amazing red perm you've ever seen in your life, played by Marissa Ribisi, who was also in the Brady Bunch movie, which is very important. But also, she is Giovanni Ribisi's twin sister. They're twins. I assumed they were related because they share a last name, but I had no idea that they were twins until I looked it up for this podcast outline. Wild. Anyways, Cynthia mostly hangs out with Mike and Tony, but they're also friends with Pink. And this is something that I think this movie also does just so well, is the way that it portrays these different friend groups that are on the surface very different, but they all have some crossover. You know, Pink is an athlete, but he smokes with the stoner kids and he hangs out with the brainy kids, and he has a popular senior girlfriend, but he also hangs out with some old towny dude who still likes to hang around with high school kids, who, of course, we will get to him, don't you worry. But that depiction of friend groups or cliques in high school is also so accurate to my life experience. A lot of teen movies portray cliques as these like very insular, rigid groups where nobody ever interacts with people from other cliques or ventures outside their friend group for any reason. And if they do, it's seen as some sort of either violation or like a social crime. And that's just not how it was for me growing up at all. I mean, it was just so much more fluid than that. There were definitely groups, but there was a lot of commingling, just the way that it's portrayed in this movie. And then we have the senior girls. Parker Posey as Mean Girl Darla. I don't know if I have properly expressed my love for Parker Posey on the podcast yet, but I just love her. I think she is so funny. She's so good in everything that she does, and she just has this great humor. I don't know. I love her, and she's so funny in this movie. And again, her part is pretty small, relatively speaking. I mean, she only has a couple of scenes, really, but she's so memorable. There's Joey Lauren Adams as well, also from Mallrats and some other Kevin Smith movies, but she also plays Layla in Big Daddy, which is one of my favorite Adam Sandler movies. I think her character's name is Simone, and it's funny because this made me realize that I don't know half of the characters' names. I just know them based on their relationships to the other characters, because ultimately that's what matters to the story. Simone is Pink's girlfriend, and then there's Jodie Kramer, Simone's friend, played by Michelle Burke, who was the daughter in Coneheads. This movie has such a stacked cast, actually. Everybody's in some other like classic movie, pretty much all from the 90s. But Jodie's little brother is Mitch Kramer. He is an incoming freshman, and his friend group form kind of the secondary focal group of the movie. We have Mitch, we have Carl, and we have Hirschfelder. Oh, and we also have Sabrina. They are all incoming freshmen who are subjected to the hazing rituals of their high school. For the boys, this means being literally spanked with wooden panels that O'Bannon and crew made in wood shop. And I think this is such a great detail. The fact that they made these paddles in school, in wood shop class. And I mean, we can assume that everybody knew their purpose, but they just didn't care. But for Sabrina and the other freshman girls, this means participating in a very elaborate routine of humiliation and mild torture, I guess you would say, in a parking lot in the middle of town, including being covered in flour, I think ketchup and mustard, sucking on pacifier is very humiliating, proposing to senior boys on their knees, I had to do that when I was a freshman, and air raiding on Darla's command, of course, and then lastly, being driven through a car wash in the bed of a truck. The movie opens on the last day of school in 1976, and we get little snapshots of all the various groups of teenagers, and they're all pretty much doing nothing. I think this is such a great way to start this movie. They're sitting around in classrooms talking, they're smoking in the bathrooms, they're wandering around the hallways, cutting class, they're finalizing the details of their paddles that they're going to beat the freshmen with in woodshop class. And I mean, aside from the paddles, this is exactly how the last day of school always was. I mean, the last week of school, really, we didn't really do anything. We were just there to be there. We weren't actually doing anything productive. And right away, we need to talk about the soundtrack of this movie. It is so good. And I really think that the soundtrack is another huge reason why I loved this movie so much. I grew up on classic rock. And when I say classic rock, I mean Zeppelin and Aerosmith, not Nirvana, okay? The 90s music, I'm just not ready to call that classic rock. But the movie just nails the music. Like every song, every scene, the music goes really well with the moment, not just the feel of the entire movie. The song they use in each scene, I think, adds so much to the scene. And the opening scene, I think, is the best one. It is set to Sweet Emotion by Aerosmith. And that kind of trippy, funky, psychedelic sound at the beginning of Sweet Emotion, as we get the opening of this movie, just sets the scene and sets the tone of this movie so perfectly. I mean, you know right away, like you can feel what this movie is going to be about, what it's going to feel like when you hear that song along with the opening little montage of this movie. So we learn that it's the last day of school, and all of the football players are asked to sign this pledge, basically saying that they won't drink or do drugs, which, I mean, yeah, this seems like a given to me. It was certainly a given by the time I was in high school. Like, of course, you weren't allowed to drink or do drugs if you were an athlete, but I don't know. Pink, our boy, is not down to sign this pledge. However, he will not give the coach that kind of control over his little teenage life because there is beer to be drank and fun to be had, okay? The talk of the entire school on the last day is that there is a party that night, and everybody knows. And this is something else that I always appreciated about this movie that just feels so authentic to my experience, is like if there was a party everybody knew and everyone went. It was kind of just an unspoken understanding amongst all of us that everyone was basically invited. If it was a proper party and not just a hangout, it was just assumed that everybody could and would show up. But one of the few plot points that we have that actually moves the story forward in some way is that Pickford is planning to host the big party that evening because his parents are going away, so he'll have an empty house. And I'm sorry, but an empty house on the last day of school, I mean, come on, parents, you're just begging for a party to be held at your house. However, the plan crashes and burns when the keg delivery guy shows up before his parents have left. And obviously he gets busted when the parents see that this guy is trying to roll a keg into his driveway. And the kids are all hanging out in Pickford's room when his dad comes upstairs to break the news to him that his party is busted and they're not actually going to go away. And the best part of this whole scene is Pickford's bedroom. It is so memorable to me. I was obsessed with it. If you've seen this movie, you already know where I'm going with this. And yes, I'm going to talk about the egg chair, that amazing egg chair that he has in his room. I still want one of those things. And his is super cool because it even has a matching ottoman with the fur lining that the chair has. I mean, come on. And then when you add in the oversized Dark Side of the Moon poster that's hanging above the chair, I mean, forget it. This was dream decor for me back in those days. But when I was rewatching this movie for this podcast, I noticed something that I can't believe I've never noticed before in this scene. Next to the egg chair in his room, there's this device that looks maybe 2 to 3 feet tall, and it has this brown base with a dial on it. Very 70s looking. But then on top of the base, it has these plates. It almost looks like 3 sets of plates stacked together on the top of it. It almost looks kind of like a fountain of some sort. So I did some research and I found this thing on eBay. It is called the ISO 2 isomerizer. Isomerizer? I don't know. It was manufactured in 1975. What is an isomerizer, you ask? Well, it is a device that was used to extract the oil from herbs. So I will let you draw your own conclusions as to what our friendly group of high school stoners would have used this device for. But how funny is that? I can't believe I've never noticed this thing before, but what a great detail. And I would imagine that this thing would have been really expensive. By the way, it's going for $1,500 on eBay right now. But I mean, we should have known Pickford was a rich kid considering he had a fur-lined egg chair with a matching ottoman. And also his bedroom was probably bigger than my first studio apartment. Meanwhile, in a parking lot somewhere else in town, the senior girls are conducting their extreme hazing rituals on the freshman girls. And this scene is perhaps Parker Posey's best work. Next to the scene in Best in Show where she has the meltdown about the bumblebee dog toy. It is so funny. She is so funny in this scene as like the mean senior girl. So the senior girls have rounded up a group of freshman girls and piled them into the bed of a truck, as one did. And I would say as one did in the 70s, but honestly, I rode in the back of trucks in the 90s too, so I don't know. It's implied that the freshman girls sort of volunteer themselves for this experience, which, I mean, you'd understandably wonder why, but I've talked about the hazing in my high school before. It was kind of like this to some extent, much less extreme, but there was this element of kind of willing participation by the freshman girls. And it was kind of like, if you went along with it, you were paying your dues, you were showing respect to the seniors in a way. And it was almost like, again, kind of an unspoken understanding. If you went along with the hazing, you could kind of breathe, you know, like if you went along with it, you could probably show up to a senior party at some point and not get absolutely destroyed because you had kind of established this mutual understanding between the two of you. While the girls are being hazed in a parking lot, the boys are being chased all over town by Ben Affleck and company with their wooden paddles. And the paddling scenes are so over the top. Like, they're in slow motion with loud music. And Ben Affleck is actually really funny in these scenes. His character gets so much pleasure and joy out of literally beating the hell out of these kids. You could just see it on his face, you know? It's like, we all knew this kid, didn't we? The kid who just loved being a jerk. The kid who made it his whole personality to be an ass. We all knew somebody like that. And like I said, if you participated in the hazing, or at least if you didn't make a huge deal out of it, there was this sort of respect that you earned along the way. And we see this play out in the movie when Jody invites Sabrina to hang out with her and the other senior girls that night after the hazing is over. And Pink invites Mitch to hang out with the senior guys after he gets his ass literally beat with a paddle. And this is where the real fun of the movie starts, at least for me, because the rest of the movie just follows these various groups of teenagers around on their night out, essentially doing nothing. And I mean, I don't know how many times I can say this or how many different ways I can really emphasize this point to you guys, but it's very important. Never in my life have I seen a more accurate portrayal of a Friday night in high school for my experience. This could have been a hidden camera show following kids in my high school around. I mean, honestly. They drive around, they do nothing, they cruise town looking for other cars full of kids who are also cruising town since the party was canceled, so there's nothing to do. And I mean, that's exactly what we did if there was nothing to do. Even down to the way that Sabrina is like sitting on the curb outside of her house waiting for the carload of senior girls to pull up and pick her up. That's how it was. Before I could drive, I would wait in the driveway for my older friends who had cars or whoever had a car to come pick me up. I'd jump in the back seat and off we would go to, I don't know, do nothing. And this part of the movie, of course, is when we get some of the best moments in the movie and also the best quotes. And it's also no coincidence, the part when we meet Matthew McConaughey's character, Wooderson. And he's so good in this movie, so funny. Definitely the most famous character from this movie. Even if you haven't seen Dazed Confused, you probably have some awareness of Matthew McConaughey's character in this movie just because of the quotes alone. But again, we all knew this guy, didn't we? Especially if you lived in a small town, you definitely knew this guy. Wooderson is older. It's never specified how much older, but it's made very clear that he's older. And he's a townie, essentially, who still hangs out with the high school kids. He probably buys beer for the ones who weren't 18 yet, you know. And he's so creepy, obviously, like as he famously says that he hangs out with high school girls because he gets older, but they stay the same age. And for some reason, once we get to the party phase of the movie, Mitch Kramer decides that an effective technique for portraying basically any emotion is to touch the bridge of his nose. Especially in the scenes at the Emporium where they go to play pool and hang out, he touches his nose every 15 seconds. I mean, it's very excessive. My friends and I used to jokingly play a drinking game where you had to drink every time Mitch touched his nose. And I don't think we actually ever followed through with this, but if we would have been very drunk. The Emporium is also where Mitch and his little freshman friends decide to get O'Bannon back for chasing them around town with a wooden paddle and create this elaborate plan to dump paint on him, which works, and he's furious. Another great scene where Ben is almost a little too convincing as a rageful jerk. But I mean, this is a pretty bold move for a bunch of incoming freshmen. If anyone would have done this for real at any high school, I would imagine, certainly at mine, they would have had a very, very rough freshman year. It would not have gone over well. But eventually the gang finds a new place to party, an open field that they call the Moon Tower because it has a big tower with a light on top of it. And a lot more nothing happens, of course. But again, it's just a perfectly accurate portrayal of a high school party to me. It's a bunch of kids leaning up against their cars in a field, kind of dancing to music in little groups, bopping around from group to talk to different people. There's a fight at the party, which did sometimes happen at our parties. Not as extreme as the fight in this movie, but it's a great teenage party scene. And the kids party until the sun comes up and the kegs are tapped, and that's basically the end of the movie. So, I mean, yeah, nothing really happens, but it's not about the plot, you know? It's about the vibes. It's about the feeling. And some of these scenes, you guys, I can feel them. I can feel what these characters are feeling. I don't know how else to describe it, but when I was rewatching this movie, I can literally feel these scenes because I've been there a million times. The scene in the beginning where they're all just sitting around the classroom talking about nothing, or the scene where the three girls are driving and they're talking about what someone else had said about, I think it's Joey Lauren Adams, and she says she's not going to get mad, but then she gets mad. And especially some of the Moon Tower party scenes, like when the stoners are sitting on the car talking about George Washington and aliens, or the very ending scene. I think this is the one that I can feel the most, where they're all in the car and they're driving with the windows down as the sun comes up after a night of partying. And it's a random group of people too. It's Pink, his girlfriend, Slater, the stoner kid, and Wooderson, the old townie guy. And they're all just laughing and You can feel it, you know? They're goofy from staying up all night, but they're happy and they're carefree because they're young. Especially there's this one shot of Joey Lauren Adams. She's in the back seat, the wind's blowing through her hair, she's smiling. I can feel that moment, that feeling of driving home from a night out with my friends, kind of feeling like death, but also feeling completely fine because we were young. And Slow Ride by Foghat is playing in the background, another great use of music to really just put you in the scene. You can feel it, you know, that feeling of being young and dumb and just living. And speaking of that, we cannot talk about this movie properly without shouting out some of the best quotes. So I will leave you with my top 10 favorite quotes from Dazed and Confused because I couldn't narrow it down to just 5. Starting with number 10, when Pink says, "All I'm saying is, if I ever start to refer to these as the best years of my life, remind me to kill myself." I think every high school student probably said or thought some variation of that at some point. Number 9, when O'Bannon yells at Slater to "Give me drugs, man," and Slater responds, "Get some from your mother, man." I can hear that exchange happening in my head. It rings through my mind. Number 8 is a classic but creepy Wooderson quote when, of course, he says, "That's what I like about these high school girls. I get older, they stay the same age." Charming. Number 7 is when Slater explains the legend behind the moon tower as they're climbing it, and he says, "This place used to be off limits, man, because some drunk freshman fell off. Autopsy said he had 1 beer, man. How many did you have?" And then Mitch responds, 4, and he goes, "You're dead, man. You're so dead." Just a little mild hazing for the freshmen. Number 6 is another Wooderson quote when he says, "Hey, man, you got a joint?" And Mitch says, "No, not on me, man." And he said, "It'd be a lot cooler if you did." This is one of those lines that my friends and I loved to quote, usually entirely out of context. Didn't really matter what someone said. The response was typically, "It'd be a lot cooler if you did." Number 5 is when Slater asks Mitch, "Are you cool, man?" And he says, "Like how?" I feel like I really understand Mitch in that moment because that was all of us the first time we hung out with older kids and we were trying to act cool, but we really were just terrified and had no idea what was going on. Number 4, once again, is from Wooderson, and it is probably the most notable and most quotable of the entire movie, and that, of course, is "All right, all right, all right." Number 3 is when Slater says, "Check you later," to the girls in the car. And this is just a personal favorite. It's almost become an inside joke with myself because for some reason my friends and I used to say this to each other constantly. I think we had even gotten to the point where we had forgotten where we got it from because we just quoted it so often. Number 2, one of my favorite quotes in the whole movie is Parker Posey during the hazing scene when she says to some random freshman girl off screen, "What are you looking at? Wipe that face off your head, bitch." Such a great line. And number 1 is, of course, Wooderson again, the most quoted man in the movie, with the classic line, "You just gotta keep on living, man. Livin." Unfortunately, I don't think this movie is streaming as of the recording of this episode. It is still June when I'm recording this, so it was not streaming. I own it on VHS and DVD, so that's how I was able to watch it, but maybe it'll change by the time this episode comes out. Regardless, if you can find it somewhere, it is a great, great, great rewatch. So much fun, and I highly recommend it. I hope you all enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I will continue with the nostalgic summer movie rewind series throughout the summer, so stay tuned for that, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode of the pod, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye!